Okay, welcome back Science 30s to our next lesson in Chapter 3. This is 3.3, and today we're going to be looking at blood vessels. Okay, so in previous videos we've talked about the heart, all its chambers and how blood flows through it, and also talked about how the heart beats, but now we're going to look at the vessels and the tubes that are going to be carrying your blood and that really make up the majority of the circulatory system, and look at them in more detail. So this is looking at the blood vessels. Now, we've talked about some of these blood vessels before. We talked about the pulmonary arteries that take blood away from the heart and go to the lungs. That's shown in blue because it's deoxygenated, going to get oxygen from the lungs. And once it gets oxygen, it comes back into the heart through the pulmonary veins coming back toward the heart. And then we said it goes out the aorta when the heart is pumped again to go to the body and deliver oxygen. And then it's going to come from the body after it's used up the oxygen and come back into the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava. So we're familiar with these terms, arteries and veins, as we can see going towards the lungs and then coming back, and then arteries and veins going towards and away from the body. Now I want to just stop here and pause for a moment because sometimes we think, okay, deoxygenated blood goes in veins, but we can see that's not necessarily always the case. It comes when it's going back to the heart from the body, that's a vein. And then when we see the vein coming from the lungs to the heart, well, that's oxygenated blood. So instead of trying to think deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood in veins and arteries, as sometimes that's how people try and remember them, think of them as towards and away from the heart. Arteries are going away from the heart, veins are going towards the heart. Depends on whether this is related to the body or the lungs, whether this is oxygenated or deoxygenated. So good to make sure those are straight. Arteries away, veins towards. But now we're going to look in some more detail about what happens at the lungs and at the body. So let's take a look at the lungs first. And when we have blood coming to the lungs here from an artery, it's going to branch into smaller and smaller sections, as we can see here. Where I'm going to start is with those kind of blue blood vessels there. They're a lot smaller than an artery, and just a smaller version of an artery is called an arteriole. So the arteries are going to break into smaller arterioles. And similar, we can see the red ones that would be coming back to the heart. Those are like smaller veins, so those are called venules. So very similar to artery and vein, just smaller. Now where all the really action happens in the lung is in those kind of balloon-like structures. It almost looks like maybe a cluster of grapes or something with all these really tiny vessels wrapped over them. Those blood vessels are called capillaries, and they're extremely, extremely small so that they can allow for gas exchange. So those balloons or grapes are what we breathe air into, and oxygen is going to be inside there. Then we need these very small veins to be really close to where that oxygen is so we can pass oxygen into those really small blood vessels, which are called capillaries. So that's where all the gas exchange is going to occur. Now, a very similar process is going to occur in the body. It's just going to have the opposite gas exchange where it's giving oxygen to the muscles and cells, and up in the lungs we were taking oxygen in. Now it's going to be giving it away near the body. But it's a very similar system. We're going to have our smaller arterioles, so arteries going to arterioles, and we can see there with a smaller blood vessel. And then also with the vein, we will have venules, again, being a little bit smaller. Okay, and then what's happening in the middle, again, is called the capillaries. I just drew it like this, showing that it branches into these tiny, tiny, tiny little blood vessels, again, really, really small, so you can have that gas exchange. So that blood is going to take in oxygen up at the lungs, and then deliver it down in the capillaries here by the muscles. Next, we're going to look at what makes up a blood vessel. So looking at the layers of what a vein and an artery are. There's lots of different layers, but we're going to simplify it into 3 layers. Now, the first layer is the one that's going to be closest to the blood that blood is actually flowing through. This is the tunica intima, and it's the most inner layer. Now it is really smooth and elastic so that it can allow blood to flow without friction. We don't want the blood getting slowed down by a rough surface, so it's really smooth to allow it to flow as good as possible. When we look at the next layer, this is the tunica media, kind of like in the middle, and that's right there in that other red color, and this is made of smooth muscle and elastin. So even though we don't think of blood vessels as muscles, these aren't these big, strong muscles, they're quite small. But this smooth muscle is going to be really important as it can allow for expansion and contraction of the blood vessel. If it needs to allow a larger amount of blood to flow through, it can open up and dilate. And if it needs to have less blood flowing through, it can constrict and have less blood flowing through it. So this can have to do with if there's injury, this can have to do with temperature regulation, all sorts of reasons why we might want the blood vessel to be bigger or smaller, and it has to do with that smooth muscle. And elastin, which is a stretchy material, you can kind of think as elastic. Okay, so that's the tunica media. The last one is the externa, or on the external outside of the blood vessel, which is right there in that darker red color. And it is kind of the protection of the blood vessel. It's made up of mostly collagen and protects and reinforces the blood vessel. And just lastly, one more term to throw in here. The hole or the space that the blood's actually going to be flowing through is called the lumen. So that's where the blood is going to be passing through. So now that we understand those three different layers of the blood vessels, let's take a look at how those layers differ from an artery and a vein. So in an artery, it's going to look kind of like this with those three different layers and the lumen where the blood flows in the middle. Now we notice that the red layer in the middle, the media, is going to be quite a bit thicker. And this is making it much more muscular and elastic. So why would the artery be more muscular and elastic? Well, the reason it has to respond to the beating heart, because this is taking blood away from the heart. So as soon as that blood pumps through the heart, it's coming into the artery at a high amount of pressure. So it needs to be able to adjust and stretch to these high pressure moments. Okay, so think of being stretchier and then also more smooth muscle, so it can adjust for changes in pressure, and so it can help regulate our blood pressure. So that's the biggest difference that I want you to remember about the artery. But now comparing that to a vein, we're going to see that the vein looks a lot larger and we have a lot more area for the blood to flow, so quite a bit bigger. These aren't to scale, but I want you to remember that the lumen is much bigger in the vein. The other thing that the vein has is it's got these valves. It doesn't necessarily look like that, but it's got valves that can open and close. They only flow in one direction, similar to the valves in the heart. And the reason for that is we talked about the artery having a high amount of pressure coming from the blood getting pumped through the heart, going right into the arteries. But then it goes through the capillaries where all that blood pressure kind of slows down and decreases in pressure. Then when it comes back into the vein to go back towards the heart, there's not as much pressure pushing this blood. So if it was trying to go up your leg, for example, and back to the heart, gravity is going to pull it back down. But we can't have blood flowing back into your capillaries. We need to make sure it keeps going in one direction. So when you're going to get some pressure, the blood's going to move up. And to stop it from falling back down, we have these veins that are going to close. Again, similar to the valves we talked about in the heart. So things to remember in our notes here: it has a much larger lumen, and it's going to have low pressure because it's not right after the heart, right? That's the arteries. And so then it's going to have valves to make sure that blood continues to go in the right direction. Okay, so now we know the difference between an artery and a vein structure. Let's look next at the capillaries. So as mentioned before, the walls are extremely thin so that we can have chemicals pass through at these really, really small blood vessels. Remember, they looked like this in the lungs, getting very, very small and wrapping over those balloon-like air sacs in our lungs. And at lungs, we're going to have oxygen passing through into the blood, so from our lungs into the blood, and then we're going to have CO2 from the blood passing out into the lungs. So we breathe in the oxygen goes in, CO2 goes out, and then when we exhale, the CO2 is released from our lungs, and that system is going to keep repeating. In the muscles, it's just the opposite. So this was the diagram we had for those. Then we're taking oxygen-rich blood to the muscles. Oxygen passes out of the blood and into the muscle. And then CO2 as a product from cellular respiration is going to come from the muscles into the blood. So again, it can be taken back to the lungs to be exhaled. So good to know those gas exchanges occurring at the capillaries. Another thing to note about the capillaries is how our blood pressure changes when the blood goes from the arteries to the capillaries back to the veins. We talked about this a moment earlier with the valves in the veins, and this I think shows a reason why we need those valves pretty well. So at the start over here, we see a high amount of blood pressure. The graph is showing blood pressure on the y-axis, and it's showing what type of blood vessel it's passing through on the x. So it starts off really high, and it's also going up and down. The reason for that is that the heart's going to be beating. So we're going to squeeze and have high pressure, a little bit lower, it's going to beat again and be going up and down like that. But as the blood starts to pass through into smaller and smaller blood vessels, it's like going from one large garden hose into branching into a whole bunch. When it separates into those other pathways, the blood pressure is going to start to decrease. And when it gets to the capillaries, the smallest blood vessel, and it's branched into a whole bunch of different paths, the blood pressure goes way down. Okay? Now, when all those paths start meeting back up as we go towards the veins, it's got no heart next to it pumping and adding up that blood pressure. So that lower pressure that was in capillaries just stays as we go into the veins. Okay? And as we go into bigger and bigger vessels there. So that low pressure is why we have to have those valves to make sure that that doesn't flow back in the opposite direction, back towards the capillaries. And our last section here is kind of the unfortunate part about the circulatory system, is that it can develop some problems with our blood vessels. So as much as this burger is wonderfully delicious, you might notice that if you've ever had one, you get some kind of grease on your hands and some salt on your hands after eating it. And unfortunately, both of those things are not great for our circulatory system. So it can cause high blood pressure. And there's kind of two reasons for this based off the fat and the salt. So plaque, which is basically another word for cholesterol or fat, can build up in arteries, making them even smaller, so making the lumen smaller. And then blood trying to flow through there is at higher pressure. So you can see three pictures here at the top being a nice open artery with good clear blood flow. The middle one having some plaque buildup, and this one having a lot of plaque buildup there. That can make it really tough for the blood to go through, or you could even get a complete blockage. So we want to avoid that if possible. And then to relate to the salt, it doesn't build up in the form of a clot or blockage, but salt causes us to retain more water, causes us to excrete less water, and that just makes this whole system more full. All the blood flowing through our body, it makes it so there's more water held in it, and so that there's more blood volume. So this kind of makes it, if you're picturing a balloon, and then if you fill it with more water, or a water balloon filled with more water, there's going to be more pressure on the outside of the balloon. It's going to feel more stretch. So if we retain more water, we're going to have more stress and more pressure on those blood vessels. And this increased high blood pressure flowing through it just overall just kind of causes the circulatory system to be having to work harder, our heart having to beat harder, and then just the more chance that something is going to go wrong with the blood vessels or with the heart. Could be due to a clot, could be due to stiffening of our arteries or our blood vessels or valves, a whole bunch of different things, which we'll talk about in a research project in class. But that's it for today's video. I hope that helped you to understand the different types of blood vessels and how they work. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson.